Morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Mindy Thompson. I'm the director for CCWT, and I have the honor to introduce our speakers this morning. So I'll say just a few words about them, each of them, and then leave it to and turn it over to them to present. So Professor Mun-Yak Chin is an assistant professor in counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is a counseling psychologist. Think I got muted, so I'm not sure how much of that you heard, but I'll start over. I'm Mindy Thompson. I'm the director of the CCWT, and I'm delighted to introduce our presenters this morning. Professor Mun-Yak Chin is an assistant professor in counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's a counseling psychologist who engages in work that promotes more equitable and compassionate systems for people who encounter stigma and oppression. Dr. Padilla was recently named the executive director of the Carnegie Mellon University Rails Fellow Program. And prior to joining CMU, he held roles at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, in which he supported first-generation students and students from historically marginalized backgrounds as they transitioned to college. So Mun is also one of our CCWT's early career scholars this past year, and so we're delighted to have Mun present and sharing their work with us, and thank you both for joining.
Thanks so much, Mindy, for the introductions and for having us, to both you and Missy. And I think it's really helpful for us to also talk a little bit about the history of a collaboration between me and Moy. And again, my name is Mun, and I'll pass this on to Moy before we speak a little bit more.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Moy Padilla, and as it was mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Rails Fellows program at Carnegie Mellon. And previously, I was the director of the Nebraska College Preparatory Academy, which is a college access and student success program that serves students beginning in the 8th grade through college graduation. And so, yeah, I was delighted to work with Mun when I was back at Nebraska, and now I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and we're so glad to all of you for joining us today as we talk a bit more on this topic of redefining success and thinking about how we can broaden our support for college students who are contemplating about leaving college. But before we do that, let me see. Okay. As I mentioned, really, this webinar grew out of our early collaborations at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, specifically in my role as a psychologist working at that point with the counseling center. We were addressing student mental health really at the end of COVID, tail end of the pandemic, the heightened pandemic at that point in time, as a part of considering how we can support student wellness in support of retention. Moy was the director of a student access program at that point in time. And we really asked ourselves this question multiple times, which was, so what happens when a student chooses to leave college for a different path? What are, in some ways, some of the directions, or what are some of our obligations as student affairs or student health practitioners, as well as faculty and administrators in the campus college? So Moy, I'll pass this to you to speak a little bit more about a student with whom you've worked.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, out of the room here, if you can give a thumbs up or raise your hand, turn your camera on, but I'm curious, how many of you are administrators or work with students in a college access or student success program? Just curious to hear or see.
I see some.
Okay. Yeah. So, one of the stories that came, and you may relate if you're working with students in that capacity, is in my role as the director of the Nebraska College Prep Academy, we work with, hundreds of students, and we watch them not only make it through high school and succeed in high school, but then enroll at the university and do really well in as college students. And as director of the program, I had staff who took pride in the students that they were serving. And one of those students that we took pride in was Christian. And so Christian was a student who excelled in the high school levels, transitioned to the university extremely well. This was a student who was being recognized for his academic achievements at the university, and in many ways was a model student for many others. He was a peer mentor, really had it all, and we really felt that he was a scholar who was thriving. And one of the things that really caught us by surprise is when he didn't want to tell us at first, but he decided that his goals were no longer at the University of Nebraska. He wanted to pursue another career path, and that career path did not entail staying at the University of Nebraska. And so while we were really ecstatic and happy for him, at the same time, it was during a time when you have a student leave the university, you pause and you ask yourself, like, did we miss the mark on something? Or we take pride in helping students graduate from the university, but we were just curious about the Christian situation. And so ultimately, we supported Christian with navigating to his next steps, and the team again was very supportive, and it was difficult to see him go, but giving all that happened, right, many times we know we feel pressure from the university to meet retention goals, to meet graduation rates, and so we were just curious about, okay, so what is had to in many ways affirm and conform and comfort the staff that, what, Christian is in a better spot. This is what Christian wanted to do. We're here to support Christian, and in many ways we're happy for him, regardless of what the retention rate may look like or the graduation rate may look like for the program. And so we really felt there was a moral obligation for us to really be student-centered, right, and focus on the success of the student from there.
Thanks, Moy. So really, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this topic, and we wanted to, again, contextualize, right, that because our work has focused on four-year degree granting institutions and with college access or transition programs in these places, it's important to note that this is the lens from which we offer these insights, questions, and solutions. Our main goals for today's webinar is to encourage us to re-examine the dominant assumptions of student success as solely dependent on graduation, and to also identify ways to better support students who are thinking about leaving college. And what we'll do today is we'll first overview the role and changing landscapes of higher ed in the US, as well as their implications on student access and student success programs. Then we will highlight, right, and summarize the consequences of using college graduation as the dominant or sometimes the sole metric for student success. And we'll also devote time at that point for a group discussion, where we'll have you go into breakout rooms and really talk a little bit more about what this could look like, or what this already looks like at your different institutions and communities in terms of expanding support for students who may desire non-college paths. Then we'll conclude with some recommendations both for practice and for research, and then hopefully have some time for Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, so to get us started, we felt that we needed to give you a little bit more of context and a little bit of kind of how we're grounding our work. And so we know that the prevailing narrative in the US has been one of college for all, right? And where students are expected to enroll in a four-year college or university after completing high school. And we want to make sure that we this expectation is well reasoned, right? There are many benefits to obtaining a bachelor's degree, some of which include, for example, having higher salary earnings, increased levels of volunteering and voting. There's reports of how college grads live healthier lives. And so there are many benefits. There are many reasons why, although this is a prevailing narrative, it is not a bad narrative, right? There's some good expectations as to why that is. So I'm curious if you can put it in the chat, or you're willing to chime in. We want to make sure that this is we hear a little bit about some of the voices in the room, but are there any other prevailing narratives that you can think of when you think about higher education? So what are some other prevailing narratives that you can think about higher ed? Pause here.
Can I just talk? Or
Of course, Sarah.
yeah,
I
I was starting to type, but then I was like, I'll just talk. I hear this a lot from my students. I'm a career academic advisor. I work with exploring students a lot. And I hear, or undeclared is what they're typically called across the country. But I hear almost on a weekly, if not daily basis, sometimes about the pride piece, like, oh, my parents won't be proud of me, or they won't be satisfied with my path in life if I don't go to college. So kind of some of those like, not only pride, but self-worth piece as well. Like if you don't have that higher education, then I'm not worth, or I'm not a good human being, all of these sort of things that I try to break down in my in my appointments. But I think that's one of the narratives that is the one that I hear most from my students.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. That is such, thank you for sharing that, because that is true. In many ways, they tie their identity, or like who I am, to whether they get a college degree or not, which could be problematic at times, right? As you probably, it's kind of what I'm hearing you say. So, okay. Lower rates of recidivism is another post that Amy put on the chat. Okay. Amy, I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you don't,
That's fine. Yeah, no, I just joined a group of folks over in the Division of Continuing Studies who are working on access to, right now it's an associate's degree, but hopefully there'll be a 4-year degree from UW for incarcerated folks in our state. And so I think one of the things that we're hanging our hat on is lower recidivism, would be a reason why funders or the state might want to fund us longer than June 2025.
Yeah, no, so there are many benefits, right? There are many benefits to higher ed. Thanks again, Amy. And again, yes, we want to say that this is important, right? We see the value of this. If we go to the next slide, there, one of the other things that we've also noted is that student success has been a ongoing buzzword in higher education for a little bit over 15 years, and this concept often pertains to retention or graduation rates, right? When we talk about student success, many times we're talking about at least from administrator side, retention and graduation. And it's not uncommon to be in higher education circles or conversations where we're talking about how students perform against these two metrics, and determine the effectiveness of any college or university against these two metrics. And higher education experts, what we're seeing now is that they're also are calling now for a deeper understanding or a broader understanding of student success to tackle it more effectively. So just talking about retention or just talking about graduation isn't really going to it might not be broad enough to understand what are the factors or the situations that might be impacting those two metrics. And so In the last decade, we wanted to highlight some of these things. There have been some great efforts across the country of institutions really piloting innovative programs and services to students to nudge or to increase completion or retention rates. Some of these that we've seen are developing outreach programs designed to prepare students for post-secondary success. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience working with that in the next slide. But these programs are not new, right? They've been around. What's been new is how we've been refining our advising models to support students more holistically. At Nebraska, when I was there's a Gallup Strengths Center. And so it focused a lot on how do we utilize a strengths-based approach to supporting students. And also, another thing has been how do we view students through a more asset-based framework rather than a deficit lens. And one of the things that you have seen, and it was celebrated not too long ago, is the first gen movement, right? We're celebrating first generation status as an identity that in the past may have seen as a deficit thing, but it's no longer that, right? So there's a lot of great progress on that. And then again, innovative approaches to support completion, such as implementing completion grants. There's offices now, student success divisions and offices that is what they're focused on. And they're sort of connected with student affairs work, with enrollment management work, academic affairs. It's a blend of all of that. And so a lot of great progress, a lot of good movement. In the next slide, I talk about, I want to highlight that the University of Nebraska was no exception to this, right? As so is, I imagine, Wisconsin and other of our Big Ten peers. But, in 2006, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, alongside with some school district, creating a partnership to create a program to promote access and support to students who are first generation to attend college. We're eligible for the Pell Grant, and we're part of very ethnically diverse communities. And so, part of the program was to, again, recruit students in the 8th grade, and then throughout high school, provide holistic, identity-conscious support to these students, and making sure that support continued through college graduation. And for many years, the program, and to this day, continues to show excellent outcomes, right? And 100% of the high school participants go on to college. Their retention and graduation rates are above the university's average. And so while these metrics are sources of pride for the program, even the students, right, they feel a sense of pride of being part of this preparatory program. As an administrator, right, I think I understand that the way this program is evaluated is based on our metrics, right? And so when it comes to supporting a student who chooses not to continue enrolling at the university, that's what there causes a little bit of pause, right? And this is where Mun and I would, chat, or I would work with Mun to say, hey, I have a student who may be facing or has, they may need to talk to someone about whatever things may be affecting them in their personal lives. But sometimes it was a good decision, and it was a better alternative path, or not even alternative path. It was just a better path for them to continue their education at another university. So, which brings us to the next to today, right? So programs like the Nebraska College Preparatory have expanded significantly. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University. We're extending what we've done at the high school and the undergraduate levels in the graduate work, in the graduate space, right? So the fellows program that I'm now launching is for graduate students who are in STEM fields and in master's and PhD programs. So it's becoming more professionalized in many ways, more specific. And again, the higher ed environment continues to evolve. The metrics continue to be a pretty important point of discussion. And because of funding implications, right, there's also this not pressure, but maybe expectation to show that we have to be accountable to with the resources that we are provided. Aside from those factors, there are other factors that are impacting higher ed, such as the implications after COVID, the remote learning and students coming back into the classrooms. We're seeing, ongoing effects of racial unrest and economic challenges, and now even world challenges, right? What's happening around our world, all that has implications on how a student performs. And so, there are many other benefits and pressures. And a couple of statistics that I wanted to share is that, most Americans, so about three quarters of Americans see the value of getting a college degree. But many, about 1 in 4, feel that higher education in its current status is falling short of its promise. And so, there's some narratives too around what are we doing to support student success, as well as the budgetary concerns that we're seeing. If not remaining constant, they're actually decreasing in many places. So all these problems are real and urgent. And ultimately, as educators, we're responsible for addressing them. And before I turn it over to Mon, I also want to, we thought that, while it's important to acknowledge that we've made great strides in supporting students, it's really important that we do not tie learning to the number of graduates or retention rates, right? And forget to think about the bigger picture. A student could go through college very quickly, earn their diploma, yet feel no connection or leave with no idea of how to pursue a fulfilling future. Retention and graduation rate does not always necessarily equals student success in every possible. And so this is where we, thinking about what is student success is really important. I think we need to consider how a college degree is one alternative for a person to achieve their personal and professional goals. So again, we don't want to diminish the fact that focusing on student success is worthy, which includes the retention rates and graduation rates. But what we want to do is and really the aim of this discussion today is to reflect how we need to not limit the temptation to reduce student success to only the most measurable elements, when in fact we have to expand on strategies and services that foster personal and academic success. So I'll turn to my colleague Mon over here.
Yeah, and I think to reiterate Moy's discussion earlier, right, the reliance on student graduation can fall short if it's used as a sole indicator or the prevailing indicator for student success. And to summarize, here are some of them. It diminishes the range of benefits of college, right? And thinking about the college experience beyond the end goal of a diploma or a degree. There is research to suggest that this includes economic benefits for folks who have had some college experience without graduation. For people, higher long-term salaries compared to non-college goers, and particularly so for historically underrepresented groups, including women and students of color. I think this also negates the personal and social, emotional, and community learning that students can gain from their college experiences, and also minimizes the effort and the investments from institutions to foster students' growth more holistically. And then, as Moy mentioned, the focus on college graduation may dismiss the realities of students' lives, as in the case of Christian. And there are various roles where college continuation, at that point in time, may not be desired or sustainable. And it's also really helpful to think about how we situate these conversations or options outside of college and advising approaches, right? and then ultimately offer a sense of connection and a sense of support for the goals of students who might not be aligned with graduation at that very moment. And then I think the third piece, which is the emphasis of student success as synonymous with graduation, can reinforce the college dropout stereotype where students who leave prior to graduation are deemed failures or not successful students. Often, they're at this point in many institutions, right? You're not included as alumni. You're not, and thinking about what tracking or the lack of tracking in terms of how students are doing or faring if they did not complete college is one thing that often is the case in many institutions. So we are really advocating for a more expansive definition of college student success, one that prioritizes, and this is not new, various dimensions of growth and learning that students experience through college. And we would love to hear, right, we're moving into our discussion where we would love to hear your ideas next. So specifically, we would like to invite all of you to reflect on these questions, and then we'll break you out into small groups. Rather, Missy will break you out into small groups. Thanks, Missy. And we can return to Christian story. There could be other folks with whom you've worked, which is in your roles. How do you respond when a student shares that they are thinking about leaving college? And then the second question is, as a higher education practitioner or student success leader or someone in your role, what are your apprehensions or fears about fostering a different path for students that may be outside of college in the immediate sense? And we've also set up, so I'm going to try and show you this. We've also set up a Jamboard where you could put sticky notes on here. And if you click on this, it allows you to put a sticky note in there. So in your groups, we just encourage you to put as many sticky notes as you can. The first question's here, second question's on the next page. You can use this QR code. I will also make sure I put this link in the chat for you to go into. I think we have some time. How about 6 minutes for a small group discussion, and then we'll come back into a larger group and have a broader discussion. What do you think, Moy?
Yeah, I think that's good. So, and I'll join a group if that's okay.
Yes. Okay, put this out there. Yeah. We're looking at the 3 to 4 group. And Missy, please feel free to, well, before we do that, any questions at this point before we pop everyone into groups? Great. Welcome back, everyone. And thanks for, really engaging on this and I've seen some of these pieces that you have put on. We also wanted to open this up to the larger group and see if there's anything that folks would like to share. And it could be anything that came up from your discussion or even from your own personal reflection in that way.
Man, I was in a room and I thought there was really good observations I hadn't thought of before. But even, for example, we were talking about how do you respond when a student shares that they are thinking about leaving college? And one observation that somebody made was, they really haven't had that happen yet. But when they imagine that this would happen, thinking about like what resources or what training do I have to connect them to, if that's what they want to do, right? And the limited training or information available for resources out there. And then another person was talking about leaving the door open for the students, right? Because many times there's a good reason why they're choosing to leave at that time, but perhaps in the future, right, they want to come back when, if that's the journey that they decide to. So I don't want to put too many words in people's mouths, so I'll just kind of take a step back here, but sort of to get this going in case somebody else wants to jump in.
I was in a room with Pa, and Pa and I were classmates together in counseling psychology. Oh gosh, that was more than a decade ago now. So it was fun to be in a room with my former classmate. But we talked about how, you know, younger versions of ourselves might have been a bit more concerned about, you know, someone choosing a different path. But, you know, the older we get and the more experiences that we have, we realize that, you know, you can define success in a lot of ways. And, you know, attaining a college degree or persisting in college isn't the only way, or, you know, even the most important way that we could define success. And so maybe the problem isn't so much with, you know, we would think like earlier versions would be like, oh my goodness, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with our program? But maybe the question is, what's wrong with the metrics? Maybe we need to come up with different metrics for defining success.
Thanks. Amy, was that you?
Yeah, yep, that was me.
Okay.
For some reason, I
Yeah.
can't turn my video back on. I'm like permanently video off, but yes, that was me.
That's okay. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think, you know, some of these pieces are what we hope to, right, is that we're thinking about how having a metric, as you mentioned, or having these pressures that in some ways are systemic, really can, they're not so much trickle down, but they really inform how we might practice and how we support students as well. And in turn, how students feel the pressures are too, whether, you know, I think Boy and I, we've talked about how often students may start to distance themselves if they are worried that college might not be the path, right? Even from programs or even from advisors or faculty, because we're in some way seen as folks who are entrenched within a system, and we uphold perhaps, right, some of these metrics, or here are some expectations or expectations of what we might respond with, or what feels acceptable in terms of the types of support that we can offer. I know too, I've also had this conversation with Pa in here about how that can feel difficult, or at least unspoken, sometimes these expectations and the norms. Yeah. We really appreciate some of these pieces and wish we could devote more time to it. And the Jamboard's available. I think it's really helpful for us to take a look and see what are some of these recommendations that folks have pulled together, and also the reality of the fears and the apprehensions if we were to, let's say, really think about how we can foster different paths outside of college for students because of the systems that we're in. So let me return to this and turn it to Moy here.
Yeah, I'm reading through the Jamboard, and I think about you know, looking more broadly. So how do you respond with a student, asking about their plans, seeking support, validating their experience, talking about their career goals, and then even with the apprehensions, right? You know, there's a sticky note that says, I'm well aware of the data pointing to the positive implications of a college degree for, and then asterisk, most individuals, right? So knowing that not all individuals, at least that's how I'm interpreting that sticky note, is, you know, that's a positive outcome. So no, very, very good. And you know, this kind of goes back to, you know, how we're proposing that we revise our definition and interventions around student success as being dependent on graduation. You know, this slide talk, you know, some questions that we would like for each of you to think through and consider and act upon at your institution, right? It's student success policies and practice, right? So some of these, for example, how do we explain to institutional leaders when students discovered an alternative educational career path, right? And there was a sticky note about how there are times where there's pressures from higher education administrators who are, you know, viewing these metrics on a regular basis. So what implications do college access and student success programs need to navigate, particularly during times of financial stress across higher education? In what ways can we position student success? So is there any response to any of these questions? A question that stands out to you and that you want to speak about? Or perhaps maybe a question that we're not asking and you're like, have you thought about asking this question?
Yeah. Feel free to post it in the chat too.
This is Amy again. Pa and I talked about just briefly how when students leave, there's usually very little follow-up. So it would be really, interesting to know what are, if students leave our programs, what are they doing? I mean, we just assume that, they've fallen off some sort of path and they're not going to be successful. But I think without the data to know what our students are doing. So I don't know how to keep in touch with the students that have left. Maybe they return to our program, or maybe they choose a different college program. That was one thing that we thought about.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll touch on this a little bit as well. Thank you.
Yeah, from my discussion with Anna at Southwestern University, Anna, you can correct me if that's wrong. I think that's right. She was speaking about being the exit interview point person, which I thought was just fabulous. I mean, I think that there are other figures at my university that do some version of an exit interview with their advisees. But she was a part of this kind of formal process of getting the students to reflect on their time at the university and then what are their plans. And we were talking about how many of them end up transferring to other institutions and, the different emotions and challenges that come up that can be more than, might warrant like a visiting to counseling services, for example. But of course, all of these topics are relevant to leaving the institution. And so I thought that was a really, really awesome part of what Anna does over in her position.
Yeah. These are really great, both questions, right, and like strategies or interventions that we can think about. And I think that leads us to talking a little bit more about recommendations for practice. We want to overview here some recommendations that we have for practice. They're not coming from us, but really thinking about what some of the research and some folks have done, right? We want to think about how we can encourage programs to align anchors of student success with broader goals for our students. So extending beyond graduation and including, right, and prioritizing dimensions of personal wellness, cultural, sense of community, and engagement. And so there are different frameworks available, right? I think that Thompson Scholars Learning Communities at Nebraska uses an ecological validation model to think about how we can validate students. And I think one aspect of this is to also prioritize that this can exist right outside of college, and thinking about how college is the place we're practicing this, and options beyond that is okay. I know you have mentioned this and put this up as well, which is, it really continues to be important for us to think about our policies around student withdrawal and return. And could we, lower barriers for students to engage with college at later points? And relatedly, redefine who are alumni. I think it's important to include all students as alumni, regardless of their graduation status. And so I think to both points made around like, how are we following students who leave before graduation? What are they doing? Are we still points of contact? Or as we think about redefining student success, do we still then become points of contact in some way to get students connected with options and opportunities outside of the college, right? And I think sometimes that would include it in terms of being more plugged in and offering connections in a way that can better support students who choose to leave. And I think this really is really meaningful and can help us both gather information how institutions can do better and maintain relationships with alumni more broadly defined, rather than just students who have graduated. And then for, I think higher education practitioners working directly with students, you all have mentioned this really like what are some ways that we can decenter graduation as the ultimate or the only path for all students, and to explicitly integrate non-college paths as options during routine advising or even support, and to continue to support students holistically, regardless of their paths. And I think it's helpful to think about how college graduation can follow, I think, in some ways, right, in terms of fostering student wellness. And again, there's a lot of research and models and also empirical support to back that up, to suggest that when we take care of students, and they're more likely to graduate, and there is retention as a part of it. But I think being careful to think about if that goal is no longer aligned, or for various reasons meshing with students' goals and needs at that point, what kinds of flexibility and what kinds of options are available to support students regardless of what they're choosing. And then we also know that there is a growth of student access and support programs that are focusing on wellness more holistically. We know about the centers, tuned-in labs that's intended to support career development from a holistic perspective. And what we are especially advocating for is for practitioners to actively integrate non-college paths as options as part of advising and student support. And then similarly, I think with research, there is a dearth of scholarship, very limited scholarship on the lives and trajectories of students who have left college. There is a growing body of work that highlights the economic returns for college experiences, but less so on the subjective lived experiences of students, right, who have left college and pursued other opportunities in their paths in terms of their life satisfaction or work satisfaction. And also, I think importantly, would love to see more research on the experiences of students who returned to college, to identify maybe the reasons and the conditions that motivate or allow them to do so, and what are some of this information that can help support the institutional practices we have. So we're gonna wrap up with this. I think Moy, had highlighted that to me, in a recent brief by the Chronicle, researchers had surveyed members of campus communities on their views and their respective institutions' accomplishments and challenges around student success. And one key conclusion is that, it can be really tempting to reduce student success to the most measurable elements, such as graduation, when in fact, I think the researchers are advocating that we ought to be exploring whether we are creating happy humans in the students that we serve and work with. And so we envision that this fuller exploration of opportunities with or without a college degree with students can further promote a culture of growth and wellness for our students who have very different lives and backgrounds, and that we support them, right, in this ultimate in their journey through college, and support their flourishing as humans, no matter what their paths. So I was going to ask Moy, do you know what Christian is up to right now? Because I'm really hoping he's happy.
Yeah, he's good. He found what he wants. Yeah, he's very completed his training and is doing what he wants, what he dreamed of doing. So he's happy. That's the thing that, although I was sad to selfishly I didn't get to see him anymore at Nebraska, I'm happy that he's happy. So
Yeah. And Moy, any final words before we turn over to Q&A?
yeah. No, I just want to, I really want to thank the participants for their contributions on the Jamboard, and I know I took away some things from those as well. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, we've come to the end. Really thank you for your engagement and joining us today. Just let us know if you have any other comments or questions. Looks like Missy posted an evaluation form as well. Please complete that. That would be helpful for us to get feedback as well.
With that, thank you so much.
I'll just jump right in for a moment. Thank you so much, Dr. Chin and Dr. Padilla, for presenting for us this morning. I know I certainly was typing lots of things on the Jamboard and thinking through the different questions that are posed, and am so glad that we're thinking about these broader ways to support students and to think about what college means in students' lives more holistically. So I appreciate both of your work on this, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
right, thanks everyone, and take care. Hope you have a good rest of your Monday, and hope to see you at more CCWT events in the future.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.